really been concerned about how they can possibly get attention to the whole issue of needing an investigation of the events of 9/11. And they've made what's really almost a completely new movie, very different from Loose Change Second Edition, which goes their new movie goes point by point through all the evidence for what happened in all the places where there were events on 9/11. So it really is trying to show what can be proven, what evidence we really have that makes people question the whole government theory of what happened on 9/11.
We have a long history of successful steel construction in this country and in fact the world. And one of the great successes is that under normal fire conditions, we don't have building collapse. In fact, until 9/11, I was unaware of any protected steel structure that had collapsed anywhere in the world.
What once seemed unthinkable has happened. On a bright summer morning, under a clear and cloudless sky, the toll has been devastating. It may be days or even weeks before the final accounting is done in terms of dead and wounded. To grasp the enormity of it is almost too much for the heart to bear. This night, we can only look back in sorrow at a world that has suddenly, perhaps irrevocably, been changed. And tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that, and in days and years to come, we will look at the calendar and remember September 11th, 2001. It is a date that will be etched in history, engraved in stone, and in our memories.
The building's exploding right now. You got people running up the street. Okay. I'll tell you what's going on.
Okay, just put Winston on pause there for just a moment.
Okay, the whole building just exploded some more, the whole top part. The entire building has just collapsed, as if demolition team set off. When you see the old demolitions of these old buildings, it folded down on itself, and it is not
10 o'clock Eastern Time this morning, just collapsing on itself. This is a place where thousands of people work. We have no idea what caused this. If you wish to bring anybody who's ever watched a building being demolished on purpose knows that if you're going to do this, you have to get at the under infrastructure of a building and bring it down.
At 10:30, I tried to leave the building, but as soon as I got outside, I heard a second explosion and another rumble and more smoke and more dust. I ran inside the buildings, the chandelier shook, and again, black smoke filled the air. Within another 5 minutes, we were covered again with more silt and more dust. And then a fire marshal came in and said we had to leave because if there was a third explosion, this building might not last.
As we were getting our gear on and making our way to the stairway, there was a heavy-duty explosion.
We get some of the people out, but then there was some secondary explosions and then subsequent collapses. So I don't know how many people were in there. I know there was a lot of firefighters, a lot of public safety personnel in there.
New York's bravest never had a chance.
We really never even got to that close to the building. An explosion blew and it knocked everybody over.
Do you know if it was an explosion or if it was a building collapse?
To me, it sounded like an explosion.
Most of the victims so far were people outside the blown-up buildings.
Like, it sounded like gunfire. You know, bang, 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 bang. And then all of a sudden, 3 big explosions.
Top floors collapsed down. I saw it blow and then ran like hell. Thank God. I'm 69, but I can still run.
We heard a big explosion coming down. Everything just went black. Everything came down, glass started popping. People got hurt, stuff went on top of them. And it was a big explosion. Everything got dark, real dark, like snow. You can see behind me, oh, this is not snow. This is all from the building. It was a terrible nightmare.
Rose Housey, one of our CNN producers, is on the phone. Rose, what do you got? I'm about a block away, and there were several people that were hanging out the windows right below where the plane crashed, when suddenly you saw the top of the building start to shake, and people began leaping from the windows in the north side of the building. You saw 2 people at first plummet, and then a third one, and then the entire top of the building just blew up, and splinters of debris are falling on the street.
We just saw that as well. The second tower, the only one that was standing, tower number 1, just we saw some kind of explosion, a lot of smoke come out at the top of the tower, and then it collapsed down onto the streets below.
The FBI is here, as you can see. They had roped this area off. They were taking photographs and securing this area just prior to that huge explosion that we all heard and felt.
We started running, floor by floor, instead of popping out.
It was if they had detonated.
Yeah,
as if they were planned to take down a building. Boom, 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 boom.
The streets of the financial district covered with debris, in some cases ankle deep. Cars on fire, cars just turned by the force of the explosions. It was like something no one had ever seen.
This huge, incredible force of wind and debris actually came up the stairs, knocked my helmet off, knocked me to the ground.
Well, me and Mr. Hess, the corporation counsel, were on the 23rd floor. I told him we got to get out of here. We started walking down the stairs. We made it to the 8th floor. Big explosion. Flew us back into the 8th floor.
We stuck on the stairs for a while. We finally got down to the lobby. Then we get to the lobby, it was this big explosion.
And the lobby looked as though a bomb had exploded there. All the glass was taken out. There were 10-foot by 10-foot marble panels that were once walls. They were loose from the wall of the Trade Center.
I go downstairs, the foreman tells me to go to remove the containers. As I'm walking by the main freight car of the building, in the corridor, that's when I got blown. I mean, the impact of the explosion, of whatever happened, it threw me to the floor, and that's when everything started happening.
You have 2 110-story office buildings. You don't find a desk. You don't find a chair. You don't find a telephone, a computer. The biggest piece of a telephone I found was half of the keypad, and it was about this big. The building collapsed to dust.
I hope I live. I hope I live. It's coming down on me. Here it comes. I'm getting behind the car. It's incredible. Okay, I'm gonna have to go find people who need help. I don't think I'm one of them. You okay, sir? Okay. There's all these noises. I don't know what it is. They say someone needs help.
Yeah, Mike! Mike! Mike, come over here! Yeah!
Anybody need a doctor?
Where are you?
Don't have oxygen.
Hello, Doc.
Hey, that guy needs some oxygen if someone can share it with him. 10-4. Thanks.
Ooh, my goodness me.
That's all that's standing are the Twin Towers right now in the background. That's all that's standing. That's it. That's all that's left.
So you're literally right inside. What time did you actually
I don't even know. That was actually, I rode my motorcycle right up from there. That was like about an hour ago, not even.
It's absolutely...
Look at that. That's all that's left.
Do you know whether that's the South Tower or the North Tower?
That's the South Tower.
And you saw no sign of life in here whatsoever?
No, I went all the way right there. Like, I don't know if they edited it out yet, but there's a big hole going down to the ground. There's nobody. But the firemen said, you know, that there's been a lot of people dead, like a lot of firemen died.
Because there were firemen in the building at the time trying to help people evacuate from the building.
Yeah, they said 200 people died. I thought the fireman I saw too said 200 people died already.
And this wall here, this is from part of the tower itself?
Yeah, that's the South Tower, the lobby. it's all the smoke and there's still fire going on in there right now.
Are you walking across?
Yeah, see,
you're walking across, and that's your friend also with a photograph. And the building on the right that occasionally appears is a building adjacent?
Yeah, and it's just gouged. Like the parts of the Twin Tower just gouged out the building. See, that's the concourse below. That's going down like 20 feet or so.
It's a bit hard to understand where things were or where are they now. Can you tell us, can you point out what is what in this maze of rubble and destruction?
This was the South Tower. This was 104, 106 stories tall. This is what is left. Up there was the North Tower. And you look, and you see, and there's no concrete. There's very little concrete. All you see is aluminum and steel.
What happened to the concrete?
The concrete was pulverized. And I was down here Tuesday, and it was like you were on a foreign planet. All of Lower Manhattan, not just this site, from river to river, there was dust powder 2-3 inches thick. The concrete was just pulverized. And
what's to explain, Governor, the smoke that still comes out of the fire?
There's still fire down below. There is such an incredibly deep pile of rubble, and the tower goes down 5-6 stories underground, that there's still fire underneath, smoldering.
This is as close as we can get to the base of the World Trade Center. You can see the firemen assembled here, the police officers, FBI agents, and you can see the two towers. A huge explosion now raining debris on all of us. We better get out of the way!
It's just been a huge explosion. We can see a billowing smoke rising. And I'll tell you that I can't see that second tower, but there was a cascade of sparks and fire, and now it looks almost like a mushroom cloud explosion, this huge billowing smoke in the second tower. This was the second of the two towers hit. And I cannot see behind that smoke, obviously, as you can either. The first tower in front has not changed. And we see this extraordinarily and frightening scene behind us of this second tower, now just encased in smoke. What is behind it, I cannot tell you.
From Chopper 2 as he takes these pictures. Jim?
Yes, I am here, Michael.
Jim, tell us what's happening out there.
Oh my We just witnessed some kind of secondary follow-up explosion on the World Trade Center #2, the one
secondary.
The second building that was hit by the plane has just completely collapsed. The entire building has just collapsed, as if a demolition team set off. When you see the old demolitions of these old buildings, it pulled it down on itself, and it is not there anymore.
That should be it.
It has completely collapsed.
The whole side has collapsed?
The whole building has collapsed.
The whole building has collapsed?
The building has collapsed.
Appearing to fall away from the rest of the building. Can we go to the tape now? Here we go, right here. This is, I mean, when you look at it, the building has collapsed. That tower just came down.
It looks like one of those scenes of an old building being, purposely dynamited and blown up.
I spoke to the chief of safety for the New York City Fire Department. He received word of the possibility of a secondary device, that is another bomb going off. He thinks that there were actually devices that were planted in the building.
I was making my way to the foot of the World Trade Center. Suddenly, while talking to an officer who was questioning me about my press credentials, we heard a very loud blast, an explosion. We looked up, and the building literally began to collapse.
almost anyone with construction experience and architectural experience would reach the same conclusions merely watching the buildings, not just Building 7, but the other two. Now, many of you here, I think, have followed this issue and know more. If you haven't, there's even more information on what happened at the Pentagon. It would appear to me increasingly the plane that was shot down in Pennsylvania was probably supposed to strike Building 7. But for reasons that we don't know, it came down. And there are many, many things written about that as well. Briefly, in the case of the Pentagon, the hole in the building is too small to accommodate the plane, they said, that hit it. There is no sign of the wings, there's no sign of the tail, there are no bodies, there are no seats, there is no luggage. This gigantic fire you had in New York, you had almost no fire at the Pentagon. The building withstood the initial impact. The windows beside the hole are not even broken. The aluminum structure or fuselage of that building could not have penetrated through the, I believe, 6 concrete walls it would have had to have penetrated through to get through the various rings around the Pentagon. The people in pilots for 9/11 Truth, after several years, obtained the flight data recorder, which shows that the plane itself was about 1,000 feet above the Pentagon and off course. And this leads people to believe that the Pentagon was either hit by a small fighter craft or by a missile. This is not to say that the large plane did not fly over the Pentagon. It's likely that it did, but it most certainly did not hit the Pentagon. There are many other things, planes in the Washington, D.C. area. It's the most secure area in the entire world after 50 years of the Cold War. You do not fly in and somebody says, I see the plane, I call Joe, and you have transponders on the planes. The entire stand down of American aircraft in the previous years, any plane that lost radio contact or went off course was intercepted by fighter pilots within about 5 minutes. In the case of 9/11, the planes flew around about an hour and a half. There's also very interesting testimony from Norman Mineta, the former Secretary of Transportation, who was in the bunker in the White House with Cheney. Cheney apparently has made the statements. They come in and they say the plane is 40 miles out, and do the orders stand? Cheney says yes. 30 miles out, do the orders stand? Yes. When they get to 20 miles or 10 miles, Cheney is rather irritated and says, no one's given you a contrary order, of course they stand. The 9/11 report reports that Cheney wasn't even in the bunker. Norman Mineta has since been re-questioned and said absolutely he was in the bunker. He was in the bunker at that time. He made those statements, etc. Also, there's about 140 cameras around the Pentagon. It's an area with an enormous amount of visual footage. No photo has ever been issued by the government showing a plane. After court orders to release that, they issued a photo which there is no plane in the photo. There are many, many other things regarding Bush, regarding Pennsylvania, and little by little the same thing. People go in and look at the forensic evidence. David Ray Griffin, speaking Thursday night of this week at St. Mark's Church here in Tucson, explained that in the Moussaoui case, the FBI, for the first time, in revealing through defense questioning, that even the FBI has admitted that you could not make cell phone calls from planes to the ground in 2001. It was not possible. You could use the phone on the plane, but not cell phones. And the widely reported calls from people calling their mother and saying, hello, this is your son, John Jones or something, and pointing out the anomaly of using your last name to speak to your mother, these were impossible, and the evidence is there to show that. Now, there's a couple of people in the audience that I'm going to ask to maybe come up and field questions if you have them, who know a great deal more about 9/11 than I do. One is Leon Byerly, who is a scientific person, a scientist, and the second person is Kirk Alexander. Both of them are activists with 9/11 Truth, and they will be here also to answer questions, whatever you may have. I want to make a couple of statements, though, and just try to point out where much of this is heading. David Ray Griffin's talk on Thursday, he spoke primarily to the issue that most Americans, most Christians, seem to have a first allegiance to nation and second to morality and to truth. He pointed this out by the large number of people reading letters from esteemed publishers and others. He has many people who are supporting him. I want to point out in this movie, if you come next week, we will give you an 8-page handout listing people in the security apparatus, foreign security apparatus, people in the academics, engineers, physicists, writers, humanities, philosophers, national science recipients, many others, listing their names who are saying we need an investigation of 9/11. So there are many people. But the issue does seem to be that many people in our country don't want to acknowledge what is going on. And I will point out to you that in Nazi Germany, Hitler claimed that the Poles, they took prisoners, they took Polish prisoners, put them in, German prisoners, I believe, put them in Polish uniforms and claimed that they had attacked Germany, and they killed them all and showed their bodies in uniforms saying these were Polish soldiers. This was broadcast to the German people shortly before Germany invaded Poland. I will point out to you, if you'll remember, in the Lyndon Johnson administration, this is the guy that was the peace candidate in '64, that shortly after Kennedy got popped, he decided, yeah, we're going to go into Vietnam, and he lied at the Gulf of Tonkin saying that we had been attacked by North Vietnamese, which the Pentagon papers and other data released in those papers showed was false. We were not attacked at the Gulf of Tonkin. He launched the longest war in the history of the United States, which killed over 60,000 Americans and over 2 million Vietnamese. This particular episode and what has occurred has now led to the deaths of over 1 million people in Iraq. I would point out that under Bill Clinton, according to the UN and the International Red Cross, over 5,000 people were dying every month under Bill Clinton from illegal actions under our sanctions. Primarily the bombing of power plants pumping water purification or water treatment. This led people largely dying from intestinal diseases, children, elderly, people without adequate diet. 5,000 a month under Bill Clinton for 8 years comes out to be quickly 5,000 times 12 is, what do we have, 60,000 times 8, 480,000 people died in Iraq under Bill Clinton. We've also seen the United States does torture, rendition, does not abide by the Geneva Conventions. We were not attacked by Afghanistan or Iraq. Now, a couple of things I'll say, and then we'll get into questions perhaps that you may have on the film that you saw. This movie said the most significant event of the 20th century was 9/11. I disagree. The most significant event, whether it's the 20th century or the current times, is how 9/11 is being used to launch global wars against international law by the United States. No one would talk about the little episode of the soldiers being placed in Polish uniforms that falsely attacking Germany to being the significant thing. The significant thing was a war that killed millions and millions and millions of people in the Second World War. And the significant thing is not 9/11, but the fact what it's being used to justify. When we look at the Project for the New American Century, we have to see it very clearly says the United States is the unitary single power, spending more money on defense than all other countries in the world combined, and that the United States will seek the resources it wants everywhere. Let me point out a couple of things. One would be the placement of our missiles in Poland and Czechoslovakia over the objections of those people. This is clearly done by people, and I believe the people who are running the show. It's not the president, something much bigger than the president or the vice president who take orders from someone else. It is a continued expansion of attack on Russia, the country that has the greatest gas resources and oil resources in the world. Those missiles are placed. Also under this administration, he has abandoned the anti-nuclear proliferation treaties and has gone on to advance atomic weaponry. He's clearly said that we don't care what the Geneva Conventions say or international laws say. We don't care whether we have evidence that they had weapons of mass destruction or not. Certainly Afghanistan did not. And we will take people and torture them, and I believe you will see them executed. The trials in Guantanamo are a complete farce. They will be a farce, and that's to justify this nationalistic feeling on the part of Americans that, yeah, those are the guys that did it. Now, this nationalism, this narrow nationalism among Americans that believe, therefore, that this government or an American government could not do this, or that we are entitled, the horror they talk about 9/11, I believe, is a fairly routine event, maybe at a slightly smaller scale, but not in aggregate. It's a routine event in Palestine, Lebanon, Syria, Afghanistan, and Iraq. Not to mention other places closer at hand, Guatemala, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Chile, Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay, which our government did, and the numbers are staggering. They are close to 1 million people that our military was involved in killing. So let's talk for 1 minute, I want to talk for 1 minute on what is fascism. This word is bandied around a great deal. I want to explain what fascism is. Fascism is where you have an extreme nationalistic element that is willing to break all normal codes of behavior, domestic law and international law, for their own narrow purposes, usually placing country, God, and state over human rights. And this would be characteristic of what happened among the Nazis or Mussolini and the followers of Mussolini in Italy, or the followers of Franco in Spain. Let me also clarify that these groups are a very small number of people. The Nazis were a small number of people with fanatic beliefs, willing to kill, murder, rob, steal, everything, and with often clearly a racist attitude. In Italy, the same. There was a very small number of people that followed Mussolini. And in Spain, likewise, the Phalangists were not a large number. What causes them to be able to take power is that the elites in those countries, the extremely rich, the rich beyond what we can imagine, decided to put those people in power. When you hear Rosie in this movie say, you know, and this is one of the stations that's owned, but there's only 4 and they own the media and on and on. She should have pointed out to you that the same people that own those corporations also own our defense industry. They are the one corporation owns another, and the elite 2% in our country own the military industrial complex, they own the media, they own the resources, they own the majority of the stock, they own the majority of the minerals we have in our country, they own the majority of the land we have in our country, and they don't make this decision lightly to place extremists in power. They do it when they feel that they are threatened. And I believe right now global capitalism, the United States feels tremendously threatened by the situation in China, which they have largely created themselves, and the situation in Russia, which still has enormously powerful weapons. Let's take a couple examples. I mentioned the missiles. A second would be the situation in Kosovo. The 4 or 5 largest military bases in the world with the United States. Number 1, I would guess, and I don't know whether the order is correct, but in the top 5. Number 1 in the top 5 would be Israel. Israel is a major U.S. military base. Henry Kissinger describes it as being a land-based U.S. aircraft carrier. And again, it is done for the benefit of the rich, and the people that live there are essentially cannon fodder, which is exactly what the British did in establishing the state of Israel. Second major bases are those that we are building in Iraq, and I presume that we are building in Afghanistan. A third major base in the world is Kosovo. Kosovo, under international law, cannot declare itself independence. And the opinion saying it cannot declare itself independent is held by China, Russia, Spain, Greece, etc. If you looked at the press in the last week, you saw people in Pristina and other places in Kosovo celebrating their independence and waving an American flag. That is very comparable to what happened in Austria when the Nazis marched in and took over Austria, and they waved Nazi flags, or the Sudetenland, or the Rhineland. This is precisely what happened. Under illegal mechanisms, the Nazis took over, claiming it was to liberate people who waved flags. You'll also see in downtown Pristina, you saw a huge sculpture in yellow, about 25 feet high, that said newborn. Those of you who don't speak Albanian, I presume newborn is an unusual word. It must be the same word in Albanian. It is not. That is there to fool us into thinking that that Declaration of Independence is real. This is an extremely important location relative to the oil in Romania, as well as the resources in the Soviet Union. I want to sum this up in saying, how should you be evaluating what is going on around us? The 3 big lies at the moment that the American people are swallowing, in addition to 9/11, would be that the surge is working in Iraq. It is not working in Iraq. And the United States will meet the same defeat that the Israelis met in Lebanon, or that we met in Vietnam, or that the French met in Vietnam and in Algeria. You cannot impose your will on another people at this time in history. You cannot do it. And the resistance in Iraq will lay low until after the elections, and they also know they're winning the war economically. The war is now costing us $970 million a day, $970 million a day. This is a war that was supposed to cost $50 billion. It's now approaching $2 trillion. We are losing the war economically. That's one lie. A second big lie is that the turn down in the American economy is a minor one. I don't think so. I think within a year we will all see this is not a minor turn down. The value of the dollar, the potential for the petroleum in the world to go to euros and not dollars is truly devastating. on the American Stock Exchange and an American business, it's very likely to happen. The placing of all of our industries offshore into China is a decision made. Those are not Chinese companies, those are American companies. And the United States is clearly in a global competition with European capital, Russian capital, and Chinese capital. And again, it's the same thing. The American people cannot grasp that this could happen. Unlike the Nazis, who were a national elite supported by their national rich, our national rich, or the rich in this country, have a global vision that they wish to nominate globally, and therefore they're not there cheering for the people that live in the USA. It's a much more sinister thing that they are supporting and doing. Now I want to close my remarks by just passing the third lie. The third lie is these elections that we're going through are going to make a big difference. We have a great deal of evidence that the elections have been rigged, and I believe rigged for a long time. That's both local. Many of you who followed the local lawsuits to gain access to the records in Pima County, Bill Reisner is now very clearly saying the RTA, the Regional Transportation Authority, was a rigged election, and they believe they will be able to prove it, and that elections have been rigged here. As a matter of fact, the investigation that they did into this electoral fraud was the first investigation ever in the history of this city. Was there ever electoral fraud? I mean, for 100 years, there's never been not even one investigation into electoral fraud, which again shows how controlled, brainwashed, naive, perhaps, that we are. So when you're looking at these candidates, there's three questions that I think are very important in the candidates that are now running for the presidency. I personally think this is much bigger than the presidency, and I believe any logical study of what went on will, in the history in the last 50 years will show that, or maybe the last 200 years would show that. But the questions, number one is, what would you do about the war in the Middle East? Now, everybody says, well, Obama's for ending the war. Let me tell you, there are at least 5 wars the United States is involved with in the Middle East. One would be in Iraq, one would be in Afghanistan, one would be in Palestine, one would be in Lebanon, one would be in Syria. Year before last, the United States provided the weapons in a war which has been condemned by Amnesty International, the General Assembly, most of the countries in the world. The United States provided the weapons to destroy Lebanon. When it was theoretically over 2 soldiers that were seized by Lebanese forces, when Israel was holding over 10,000 Lebanese and Palestinian prisoners. And any reasonable thing would have exchanged them, not destroy them. The war is not over within Lebanon. And our paper gives us a little tidbits and doesn't explain it. That war is a hot war. It is continuing. Obama has said nothing about it. He didn't say it when these things were happening. He said not a word. No one understood it, and not Hillary, and certainly not McCain. If you look at the war in Syria, Israel bombed Syria 4 months ago, put out a false story that they bombed a reactor. Clearly a violation of international law. Obama said nothing. The war in Palestine, in the last, I believe it's the last 6 months, it may be the last year, 29 Israeli civilians have been killed, something like 265 Palestinian civilians have been killed. Palestine, the people's land that was confiscated between 1948 and about 1956, is within 150 miles of them. And their land was confiscated and they were put into refugee camps in Gaza and in the West Bank, and it is open season on them today, dropping bombs on them, firing missiles on them, whatever they want. And naturally, they do fire back with very, very, very inferior weaponry. It is a slaughter. The siege of Gaza is very comparable to the siege of the Warsaw Ghetto that the Nazis did. And it is illegal under international law. It is disgraceful. And again, I've heard nothing from any of the people who are running for office. In the case of Afghanistan, Obama is actually saying we have to provide more troops into Afghanistan. We have to push the war in Afghanistan. He's also saying in the total military, we need another 90,000 soldiers in our military. This is the peace candidate. This is the person that many of us have the greatest hope for right now in our fears that exist. They need to be asked, what is your position on all 5 wars? How have you voted? Will you speak out? Will you abide by international law? The second thing they need to be asked, and this is coming from the World Social Forum 2 years ago, the 3 principal questions: in the United States wars, plural, in the Middle East. The second issue is, do you stand for impeachment of the Bush and Cheney administration? starting perhaps with those two, but there's many, many, many others that fed false lies about the war, knowingly fed those. It can be proven, I believe, by reasonable attorneys in a fair court. I have heard nothing from Clinton or Obama, and certainly not McCain, in putting these people to an impeachment. It's very important that we do it, or we'll merely repeat what we saw Lyndon Johnson do in Vietnam, Ronald Reagan do in Iran-Contragate, Clinton doing the illegal sanctions, and now this administration on a much larger scale. The third issue that did come up in the World Social Forum, which to me I was very pleased it came up, was an investigation of 9/11. Have you heard anything in your debates about an investigation of 9/11? I've heard about change, turn a new page, we're a great people, change is us, we are here. I mean, it's all like Toys R Us or something. It is ridiculous. Now, why has this happened? Again, the elite 2% in our country do control the media. They do control the television. They do seem to control the academics through research. They do seem to control the economy. And people are tremendously worried about their business, their job, their corporation, their whatever. And the economy is getting much worse. That 2% is making more money off of this war than any other people that have ever existed in the history of human beings. They make money every single day. And all of the things you see, whether it's the defense industry, the war, the economy, the exportation of production, it pulls our society apart, pulling the wealth to the top to give them the ability to control us. Yeah, I suppose those are the three questions that need to be raised. Now I want to tell you what happened when we have raised these questions, say with Gabrielle Giffords. Gabrielle Giffords, after being provided, her staff being provided books and DVDs and polite discussions regarding 9/11, said that he'd looked at Wikipedia and he really didn't, this is her chief aide in Tucson, didn't really think it was worth troubling the Congresswoman over 9/11. Gabrielle Giffords is a major funder of Raytheon. If you read in that handout, this is something that we did ask David Ray Griffin about. The issue in here about the technology developed by Israel and Raytheon. They have the technology to take over planes in mid-flight. It was a very logical program so that if a plane was hijacked in the United States, you could take over the plane, jam its ability to communicate, and land the plane. If a person on the plane was insane and wished to take whatever weapons they have and try to kill passengers, they could, but the plane where it landed at the nearest base clearly would have security forces to secure the plane and take that out. That technology was developed and was tested 5 months before 9/11 occurred. It was tested by Raytheon. That's in here. I did ask David Ray Griffin if that's true, that that technology exists, and he said, to his knowledge, it does. Giffords has been a consistent funder of Raytheon. Her wish list, like others have wish lists to help the children get schools. Her wish list included missiles, missile development. She's firmly in bed with the military-industrial complex. She also, her staff, there was a very interesting meeting last week of Democracy for America. These are progressive people in the Democratic Party, but it also includes Greens, Independents, and others, asking her chief aide. You never get Gabrielle Giffords. You get her underling and then her local office. This was her #1 flunky from Washington. And she faced a very hostile crowd of about 50 people meeting at the Ward 6 office. She said that poor Gabby couldn't do anything about impeaching Bush and Cheney because Nancy Pelosi wouldn't like it. And besides, Gabrielle Giffords was merely a fresh person, what do you call them? First-year congressperson. You couldn't do that. If you're just there, you'd be weak. Now,
and Jody, there isn't time in Washington to defend the Constitution.
Right. All these questions were raised and gone over with her, and they were rubbish. At one point in her discussion, she said, apropos of I could see nothing, that we have to realize that we are a peaceful people. We American people, this is a peaceful people, to which I certainly responded, you mean 2 million dead in Vietnam and 1 million dead in Iraq, and are you out of your mind? She sounded like a very bad, warmed-over version of Hubert Humphrey and Walter Mondale. And she tried to say that the Democratic caucus in Washington consists of men and women and minority people and on, whereas those nasty Republicans, those terrible Republicans, were generally white and male. Now, I might not dispute the content of the, as characterized, but I most certainly would contest that you don't have people in this country who are female or brown or black who lie closer to the spectrum of fascism than of democracy we have in this country. And we were supposed to be fooled by this talk. The people were not fooled. I don't know what we do. I think we need to know as much as we can about what the Nazis did with this. I think we need to do everything we possibly can to inform other people. The movies which are coming, the speaker coming, we've been here 5 years actually. The 5th anniversary will be in the month of April. We do 20 events a year, that's 100 events. The best speaker we have had in the entire 5-year period is the person speaking this next week. Truly an amazing human being that sees things very different. Loose Change Final Cut is a completely different version than second edition. That will be shown in 2 weeks. We will have DVDs here for sale. I think people need to raise this wherever you can raise it and have the courage to raise it, to explain to people this is why the schools are overcrowded or closing. This is why we don't, forget this business of the mortgage thing. Half of our people do not even own a house and have no income that would allow them to buy a house, not to mention the people that thought they had the money and are now losing it. Our infrastructures, our hospitals, our universities. We need to raise it everywhere we can. And if you watch a movie like this one tonight, Dustin Mugford is a pretty regular guy who just got into it. The people made Loose Change. This is not rocket science. With the evidence from thermodynamics, structural engineering, chemical analysis, eyewitness testimony, analysis of photos. This is not rocket science. There's not a university or college in this country that couldn't run this analysis. The problem is their heads, and I don't need, after, in my case, many, many years of watching movies about the nasty Nazis. That the problem was the German people. The problem is not all the German people, but the majority of the German people felt they were victims, they felt that they were entitled, and they went along. Or they were oblivious until it began to happen and rain down on them. This is our problem as a culture. Many of our people can't imagine what it's, and don't even try to think, what's it like in the rest of the world? Just what is this candidate going to do for me? That's one problem. Secondly, they don't look at history. Third, they feel that they're entitled to something. Fourth, they feel that they are victimized when compared to the majority of species. But the main point David Ray Griffin said, our allegiance should not be to our nation, but to the species and to life. A very strange question a person asked him about the book of Revelations and all this, you know, coming of Jesus and all this, none of which I buy. And I was very curious how David Ray Griffin was going to answer. And his answer was that the demonic is us, not the devil. And that he doesn't think it's the same thing as the book of Revelations, but there are many, many people in the sciences now saying that if we do not come to grips with globalization, global capitalism, inequity in resources, and what we're doing to the planet, we have a limited opportunity of maybe 100 years. And does anybody see anything happening in Tucson to stop automobiles, conserve fuel, cut heat? We see nothing. It's just business as usual for capitalism, which in Tucson is the defense industry and the developers and the roads and the da-da-da-da. That was a very strange and unusual answer that I thought you might appreciate. Yes?
There was a lot of information coming in from many countries that 9/11 was imminent. Was this clearly planted? Is that the only conclusion we can come to? If it was an inside job, then it must have been an inside plant of all that information, yes? No?
Planted by who? I'm not sure.
But
No.
as in part of the inside job.
No, I think...
What information would there have been about an imminent attack from the outside? Where would that have come from?
Well, let's analyze that and explain where it did come from. Number one, we have people in our FBI and in our military intelligence who warned the president and the head of the FBI and the head of armed intelligence. Absolutely. I'll get there. Give me a minute. I'll get there. The point is, we do have people whose job is to see that there were the issue of there was going to be a plane and the plane is going to fly into the buildings. And this is when you see something like that, generally speaking, we have many examples in history. You infiltrate that, you amplify that, you use it to your advantage. For example, in 1939, there would have been many opportunities. I'm sure the Polish people were resisting the Germans. Okay? You take that, you turn it around, you amplify it to use it to your advantage. As for international security apparatuses, I have no doubt but that German intelligence, British intelligence, Israeli intelligence, probably French intelligence, Italian intelligence, knew that there were people going to carry out these kind of flights. So we have plenty of evidence that people in our government knew there was a potential for planes to hit buildings. But we can now see what occurred could not possibly have occurred because of a plane hitting a building causing it to melt or 19 guys. We know that that lie was taken and amplified. We also know that our government has said to Sibel Edmonds, who is a major researcher, and others, we don't want to look at your research. We don't want to let you testify. We're putting a gag order on you. So yes, they knew this was likely to happen. They knew it after the first attacks on the World Trade Center. Their aim was to demonize all Islamic people. The Cold War is over. We cannot demonize the Russian people, so let's pick another people. Let's demonize the Muslims. That's it. And tax the people in this country and spend more money than we've ever spent on defense. And if we're sufficiently ignorant and racist, that's what occurred.
Is there a contradiction that it was them that did this to what we're learning about it being an inside job? I
think it's a big contradiction. I think we need to understand the objective of the Project for a New American Century. And, you know, we often think it's, well, these particular guys, Wolfowitz, Peralta. Let's not kid ourselves. It's the extreme wealthy in our country who are saying the earth is running out of resources. There are too many people on the earth. Something's got to give, and it's not going to be us. And we don't care what we do to the Chinese or the Russians or the Muslims or the Africans or the Latin Americans. That decision has been made, and the war is going on right now. We may not see that, but that's a decision that they've made, at least in my opinion. You guys want to add something to that?
Joyce, thanks for that question. I would answer it this way, maybe. If Al-Qaeda is a CIA creation, and Al-Qaeda is being named as the sponsor of 9/11, and it's a CIA creation, and the code words Al-Qaeda are used to refer to the operatives who planned and carried out 9/11, this might help explain why we receive so many warnings from all the international intelligence agencies about the coming attack by Al-Qaeda, a CIA subdivision.
Asking if that's been part of the discussion, that's really the conclusion we have to come to, that all of that intelligence was planted, basically, you know.
And not necessarily planted. I mean, intercepting telecommunications traffic, discussing operations, future operations of Al-Qaeda might be genuine traffic. It might be planted, but I'm just saying, if the code words Al-Qaeda are being bandied about in the telecommunications traffic and other international agencies pick them up, I can see why we might receive advance warnings.
Let me try it another way. In the case of the Jews in Poland, the Germans called them outlaws, terrorists, and criminals. Well, what would you have done if you were Jewish in Poland? Would you have resisted? Many Jewish people heroically resisted against the Nazis. Let's try to take Palestine. Oh, the Americans love democracy, so fine. They said, great, we don't want any more corruption out of Palestinian Authority. We elect Hamas. The Americans go, no, terrorists, okay? So if you bomb Palestinians from a helicopter or with large missiles, that's called an act of war. But if the Palestinians hit you with a small rocket or stab you in the market, that's called terrorism. So we have to understand terrorism is the main vehicle to replace the red devil. Now it's the terrorist devil. So anyone that opposes the United States or the will of the top 2% in our country will be called a terrorist. Forget international law. Forget evidence. That's what they're doing. So an important question for these people running for presidency is, well, do you think the terrorists are after us? And they watch it. They're all waving flags saying, got to go get the terrorists. All of them. That's part of the game that many of our people are swallowing.
Is there anyone here after what we've seen and heard tonight that still has doubts about what we're talking about? I don't see how there could be. There's one here. Would
You didn't ask the same question.
I'm sorry?
The first question you asked, do you have doubts and are you willing to share them?
Sure.
Now you just asked if we had doubts. And the answer is yes, I do, and no, I don't.
Sure. Yes,
but I do.
No, you're not willing to share them?
Correct.
Okay.
But I do have some questions.
All right.
Because, first of all, in the movie, was it Stephen Jones from BYU?
Yes. Sure.
Who had a piece of the metal?
Molten
okay.
metal.
Where did he get it, and how do I find out more about that? Because I'm interested in that information.
Stephen Jones, if you would like.
You can also.
I mean, it has to be on the net.
Take the computer, go to 9/11 Blogger or 9/11 Truth.
Is that on this?
Jones. And to where it came from, if you saw Jeff King at MIT, all of that debris, people collected bags full of that debris.
Okay.
They also have gotten photos which were unintentionally showing how the steel was cut. So that debris came from the sites. You may recall that only a year ago, they started a year ago. This would have been 6 years after 9/11. They began to find body parts and things on top of the buildings. My guess is you go to New York right now and go on tops of some of the buildings and find evidence. You don't need a lot to be able to show this. Regarding the temperatures they're talking about, I'm an architect. Let me tell you, steel buildings are not brittle. You can take a coffee cup and you drop it, it breaks immediately. That's brittle. Steel structures are ductile, and they do not pop apart. Steel buildings are put together with welds and bolts, and if any of you own metal lawn furniture, try to destroy one of your tables or chairs that's welded together, and you'll find it doesn't suddenly just go pop. It doesn't do that. You remember a little kid used to make houses of cards and blowing it all came down. Steel structures are ductile, and when the man said that they are redundant, that meant they're way over-designed. And the steel can follow the loads many ways, not just the way they are. Also, his point about when you have a gravity load, the gravity load is only straight down. Gravity doesn't work sideways. So when we see things going out like this, there has to be some other force pushing them out. Also, when they told you that the concrete just blew up in the air, well, nothing falling on top of it will cause it to blow up. It had to be blown up with something else. The last one, the molten metal. Gravity loads hitting the ground are not exothermic. Exothermic means a reaction that creates heat. Gravity loads don't create molten metal. There has to be a different energy source to do that. And in the case of the fires in New York, whoa, they had to be some very powerful source. They were not gas lines or aviation fuel. You can't melt metal with aviation fuel. And FEMA admits 90% of the fuel was blown up.
Exactly why I asked that question, what the metal was, if there was an analysis of it. So, but I mean, okay, Stephen Jones. Stephen Jones is a very common name, but so if I Google Stephen Jones and
BYU,
or you can do Stephen Jones BYU 9/11 Truth, and I'm sure he'll be glad to give you all the information.
Okay, that's what I'm interested in.
If you come next week, we will give you a list of hundreds of people in physics, engineering, science, chemistry, the arts, the defense industry, the government, foreign.
Yeah, I'm interested in the science, but
we need an investigation. You have not asked a question.
Yes, I'm no rocket scientist, and correct me if you recall, one of the fine films we saw within the last year stated a witness in Pennsylvania who said that the crater was strewn with airplane parts that were military green, and some of them were rusted and burned as though they'd been taken out of another dump site somewhere and planted there.
I don't know.
Do you remember which film that was in?
I remember clearly the film that we showed that the guy said the hole was 20 feet by 10 feet. And I'm trying to figure out how in the world does a 747 go into a hole 20 feet by 10 feet? That seems fairly compressed before it hit. I don't know. The point is we have many conflicting pieces of information.
There's a book on Flight 93. It's come out in the last year by a British investigative journalist named Roland Morgan. The book is titled Flight 93 Revealed. I really recommend I think it's maybe the most comprehensive analysis of everything that's been uncovered so far regarding Flight 93, which I think is what we've been talking about here for the last few minutes. So if anyone wants to dig into Flight 93, Roland Morgan, Flight 93 Revealed.
It's actually not that secretive, except that it is made secretive because people are completely overwhelmed with an ocean of information where Bush was resisting.
He resisted for over 400 days.
Right, right. And then,
the 9/11 Commission.
And then they floated Henry Kissinger. Yes. And then they said, no, Henry Kissinger has too much baggage. So by the end of that period, I was watching it from a standpoint of a social scientist, and I was saying, wow, this is sophisticated brainwashing, whereby the 9/11 Commission was supposed to be believed, and it was believed, as a credible investigation. And this was done in daylight. reported by by Associated Press, by Reuters, by BBC, by ABC, by CNN, all organs of the empire media. So for people, the reason I'm mentioning this is that for people who are looking for deep, dark corners and secrets to find out how the system works, you know, it doesn't work that way.
Well, let me try a couple of things on. I agree with much of what he's saying. In the case of Kissinger, the wives of the victims of the World Trade Center said, if you're going to be head of the commission, you must release a list of all your clients. And Kissinger did not want to do that, which would immediately blow his cover. Let me give you an example here in Pima County. And it is hard to get the information. If we knew who owns Pima County, most of Pima County is not even owned by people in Pima County. It's owned by out-of-state corporate people. If we could see who's making the money in rent, real estate, manufacturing, defense, name, address, and income. If we could see how much money is created here in tourism, in education, in defense, in construction, and in real estate, we would be an informed electorate. And we would know right away when something like the Regional Transportation Authority comes along, and you've got about 1,000 people opposing it, suddenly you get 9 guys, each giving about $200,000, plus the Phoenix Association of Realtors giving $240,000 to plan transportation in Tucson, sort of a tip-off. And those people had $1 million bucks and Shazam, it passes, because they can do the billboards and the ads and on and on. So one of the key things in understanding classes is having an understanding of the political economy, an accurate one that tells you how many people are renters, how many people have an education, how many people have health insurance, how many people own a vehicle, etc. That we could analyze it. It's not that hard. That information is readily available on computer. But you'd have to have the permission of the people that run the county or the newspaper. And those institutions are controlled by the people on the top. I guarantee you when they make investments, when the top people in this county make investments in land or almost anything, they do it on the basis of information. These guys don't roll the dice. Capitalism is highly scientific. We don't have that information. They do. We don't. Every now and then people get the idea that democracy works or that, you know, that I'm the president. I mean, it goes to your head. You see some of these guys. Remember the guy, Alexander Haig, who said, I'm in charge, you know, or whatever, okay? It goes to their head. They actually think I'm in charge. And the ruling class has to say, listen, sucker, we run it. Shut up. Play your role, okay? They want good actors. So who's the greatest communicator we've ever had? A really crappy B actor named Ronald Reagan, okay? Go check out the movies. They're hysterical.